Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Christmas and Other Horrors, an anthology of solstice horror. Edited by Ellen Datlow. Narrated by Carrie Coello and Andrew J. Andersen. Introduction. What do you think of when you think of the celebrations focused around the winter solstice? Gift-giving? Eating and drinking with friends and family around a fire? But what if someone in your family wanted to kill you? What if the jolly, gift-giving Santa Claus got pretty damned angry if he didn't get what he considered his due? What if you discovered that your friends lied to you? What if the rituals you've honored over the decades are broached just one time? Even though many celebrate the winter solstice as a time of joy, there is a darker tradition of ghost tales and horror stories taking place around the time of the winter solstice. The stories in this anthology embrace that dark tradition by presenting the unholy, the dangerous, the horrific aspects of a time when families and friends come together, for better and worse. Here you'll find the Celtic Mary Lloyd, wood demons of Finnish mythology, the Schnabelperchten, creatures from Austrian mythology that will punish you if your house isn't up to their standards of cleanliness during their annual visit, the Lord of Misrule, whose origin dates back to Roman times and who was appointed a master of revels, a Santa Claus who is not the nice guy we like to believe he is, a carnivorous witch, young gods overthrowing older gods, a time-tripping nightmare on the shortest day of the year, and other strange horrors. I hope these stories will amuse you while causing that cold finger of dread to creep up your neck.
The Importance of a Tidy Home. Christopher Golden. If anyone had told Freddie he would one day be elbow-deep in a garbage bin behind a third-rate restaurant in Salzburg, searching for a late dinner, he would have scoffed at them. Haughtily, of course, the way professors are meant to scoff. That had been his occupation, both vocation and avocation, until 1957, when addiction to morphine had led first to petty crimes and then to a psychiatric hospital. This was before Austria had begun to approach drug addiction as a problem requiring treatment instead of punishment, and so there had been a bit of time in prison as well. Prison had helped. Freddie knew that wasn't the case for many who had been in his position, but for him, prison had been a time of clarity. Without drugs, without alcohol, without distraction. He had learned that the mania he had always experienced, the way his skull felt like a hive of agitated bees, could be survived. And if that meant he sometimes saw things that weren't there, or said things that others interpreted as either a bit mad or wildly inappropriate, well, that was the eccentricity of a professor. Of course, once he had been released, no one wanted him as a professor anymore, or anything else, for that matter. By that night, the 5th of January, 1973, he had been living without a home for 9 years, during which time he had never diluted his brain with a single ounce of alcohol, nor the use of any illegal substance. But since the polite society of his city had finished with him, Freddie had finished with it. He lived in its parks and haunted its alleys. He accepted the offerings of strangers but never met their eyes. He forged a life from their cast-offs, from food and clothing discarded and forgotten, just as he had been. The first time he saw the Schnabelperchten walking the streets in their black robes, with their gleaming shears and their enormous, bone-like beaks protruding from beneath their hoods, it did not surprise him that they passed him by. Their duties could not bring them to his doorstep, because of course he had none. No threshold, no door, no visitors, nowhere to mark the start of a new year, only the continued existence of life invisible, a creature unseen, quiet, even when loud. The Schnabelperchten were even quieter. Tonight, He and his friend Byrne were out together in search of food. Freddy had forgotten the date until he spotted the creatures. It was the 4th January 5th he had seen them, and each time they had ignored him. He presumed they appeared every year, and that he had slept through their arrival in the years he had missed them. He watched as they crept along the streets, leaving no trace of their passage through the lightly falling snow. They were delicate creatures, some with their brooms and others with shears, and no door was ever locked to them. Every home opened, no matter how tightly it had been shut up for the evening. "Chee, chee, chee," they whispered in the hush of falling snow, and they went about their business. Freddy climbed down from the side of the garbage bin, holding the bag of leftovers he had known he would find there. The kitchen staff had always wrapped the food being discarded and placed it in a single bag, along with the uneaten bread. The restaurant manager frowned upon this practice, and had shouted at his employees for encouraging nightly visits from the homeless, but they were kind and waited until he was out of the kitchen before putting out the bag. This place was no Gablebrow, but the staff there had never been so kind, and even if they had been, Freddy did not like roving around that part of the city late at night. It felt more empty, more open, as if anything could happen. Here, there were many homes, lived in by people who desired quiet evenings, away from the downtown. A clang of metal echoed along the alley. Byrne had let the garbage bin's cover come crashing down. Freddy glanced anxiously around, afraid they would draw unwanted attention. If they created any nuisance, their lives would become more difficult. Sometimes he grew frustrated with Byrne for his clumsiness, though never for his addiction. Alcoholism made Byrne a fool, but it was the engine that drove him, as much a part of him as his left leg. "Hush!" Freddy said in German, more a plea than an admonition. "Don't be a fool." Byrne did not so much as look at him. Thin and gray, unshaven and unkempt, in an ill-fitting suit that did nothing to disguise the state of his dissolution, he staggered from beside the bin to stand next to Freddy. "Don't you see them?" he whispered. Freddy glanced from the alley into the street again. The Schnabelperkten were still passing by, spread out like a hunting party, perhaps 20 feet separating each from the next, some on one side of the street and some on the other. The most fascinating thing about them was the size of those beaks, at least 18 inches in length, but wide enough that if one could draw back their hoods, the creatures would not have any face at all. Or so it seemed. Only beak, the gray-white of bone. The first time he had seen them 9 years ago, Freddy had been reminded of old photos of plague doctors, but these were not masks, nor did they have anything like goggles to resemble eyes. They glided along the road. Even as he looked, he saw one approach a door that led to a stairwell rising to the apartment above the flower shop across the street. Silently, Freddy hoped the owners of that shop kept a tidy home. "Freddy," Byrne rasped, shaking him by the shoulder. "Don't you see them?" "Hush! Of course I see them." "Are they ghosts?" Byrne whispered. "They don't look like ghosts. They seem solid enough. Are they demons?" Freddy pondered that. "Honestly, I'm not really sure what they are, though they are certainly not people. They are Schnabelperkten." The word caused Byrne to screw up his face in a way that made him look like a toddler given an unfamiliar vegetable for the first time. "I don't understand. You've just said they're not people, not human. Aren't you frightened?" Acid burned in Freddy's gut. His laugh was bitter. "Of the Schnabelperkten? Certainly not. You and I have nothing to fear." "But what are they?" Byrne prodded. Freddy gazed at him, trying not to let his friend see the flicker of distaste that passed through him. "I forget sometimes that you are not from Salzburg. What has that got to do with anything?" "If you were a child here, you would know the story," Freddy replied. He patted Bern's back. "Come with me." His friend hesitated, but when Freddy began to walk along the alley, Bern followed. Most of the Schnabelperkten had already passed by, but there were a few stragglers who had gone to the homes along the street and only now emerged. Without eyes, it was difficult to know for certain whether the Schnabelperkten noticed them, but they showed no interest. They might as well have been dust motes in the air or dry leaves that skittered along the road. "Do they not see us?" Bern asked. "They are like most of the people in this city. We are invisible to them," he replied. One of the Schnabelperkten passed by, and in the light of a street lamp they could see blood on the blades of its shears, dripping onto the street. When Bern saw that blood, he looked as if he might be sick. "Come," Freddy said. "Those two." He pointed at a pair of the creatures further up the block. They approached the door of a 2-story home. Bern followed anxiously as Freddy crept up behind the two beaked inspectors. One of them extended a skinny hand with long fingers like the legs of spiders and turned the doorknob. It ought to have been locked, and Freddy believed that if he or Bern had tried the knob, it would not have turned. But for the inspectors, no door was ever locked. They opened the door and stepped across the threshold. Freddy caught the door before the Schnabelperkten could close it. He heard Bern suck in a terrified breath behind him, but the inspector who tried to shut the door just left it and began to move through the house. "I followed them before," Freddy whispered, worried more about disturbing the family living in the home than drawing the attention of the creatures. Inside, the inspectors began to move about the place, spidery fingers gliding along tabletops in search of dust, beaks lowering to discover if the floors had been swept or vacuumed. "Chee, chee, chee," they said quietly, without mouths. One in the kitchen brought its head down close to the stove and seemed to study its surface for much too long, perhaps deliberating on its relative cleanliness. Freddy leaned over to whisper into Bern's ear. His friend was trembling. "It is the Epiphany," he said. "Christmas ends tonight. January 1st begins the calendar year, but tonight is truly the beginning of the new year. The Schnabelperkten bring happiness and blessings for the coming year, but only to those who are properly prepared for this new beginning, who have set their houses in order." "What happens if they enter a home that has not been tidied in anticipation of the new year?" Bern whispered. Bern watched intently as one of the inspectors went up the stairs, shears hung at its side. Freddy understood his fear, even found it somewhat delicious. But Bern was his friend, and he knew there was cruelty in allowing him to continue in ignorance. "Something horrible," Freddy said. He took his friend by the wrist and shook it, forcing Bern to look at him. "But we have no home. They are not here for us, do you see?" At last, Bern seemed to exhale. Moments later, the inspector who had gone to the second floor returned, its shears still clean. It joined its fellow Schnabelperkten, and the creatures walked right past Freddy and Bern and out the door. This time, it was Bern who led the pursuit of them. Out on the street again, the breeze was chilly enough to remind them they were alive. Snow fell gently, a hush that felt like it made some sound just beyond the limit of their hearing, though it was only silence. In morbid fascination, they followed the two creatures while other Schnabelperkten drifted along the street around them, wordless and intent. Moving amongst them, ignored as if invisible, long after midnight and in the quiet hush of gently falling snow, they might as well have been wandering the street inside some Christmas snow globe. "What are they?" Bern wondered aloud. "Spirits," Freddy replied. It was the only word that felt acceptable. He had so many questions, but no real answers. The Schnabelperkten came out one night a year, which meant every other night they were somewhere else. If he could ask them anything, it would be about that. Schnabelperkten glided silently from building to building. Up along the road, Freddy saw others crawling on the outside of several taller buildings, cloaks billowing in the breeze as they slid open windows that should have been locked. One perched at the edge of a rooftop, scuttled to a domed skylight, opened it, and vanished within, its beak leading the way. Somewhere, Freddy heard a baby crying. The infant's wail pierced the oh-so-silent night, and then abruptly ceased. He pressed his eyes tightly shut, forcing himself not to imagine the things his darker fears wanted him to imagine. They reached the house where the two Schnabelperkten they were following had gone inside. Byrne turned the knob, and the door opened. It had unlocked for the inspectors and remained unlocked, at least until the creatures departed. Byrne did not hesitate now. He stepped over the threshold as if he had forgotten Freddy entirely, too curious, too eager. Suddenly this felt too intimate. They were intruding on this quiet moment, this breath taken and held until sunrise, when the new year would really begin in earnest. He had a spot behind an old, crumbling school building where heat vented from inside created a small bubble of warmth near the dumpster. The roof's overhang kept the elements off his head, except on the worst nights, and he wanted to go back there now, to his spot. "Byrne," he rasped, trying to grab his friend by the back of his coat. But Byrne had passed through the home's little entryway, where coats hung haphazardly on metal hooks. Too many coats, too few hooks, and 3 pair of winter boots were arranged along the wall. Not impeccably neat, but he thought they would pass inspection. Then he followed Byrne into the living room, and he froze. Antlers hung from the wall above the fireplace. The room held an eclectic array of furniture, most of it threadbare and in mismatched floral patterns. A small black-and-white television stood on a tray table beside a fat armchair. Magazines were strewn across the coffee table and piled beside the armchair. An open box of biscuits sat amongst the magazines. A coffee cup and a plate of crumbs and grape stems had been abandoned there. The entire room needed to be straightened, vacuumed, dusted, but the worst of it was the stink of cat urine and the litter box in the far corner, in front of an overstuffed bookshelf that looked as if the books had been stacked and piled by an angry drunk. Across the room, through an arched entryway that led into the hall, Freddy saw the two Schnabelperkten return from the kitchen and start up the stairs. Byrne padded across the stained carpet to follow. Freddy lunged to grab his arm. "Don't be a fool." Byrne turned to glare at him. "They can't see us." "We should not intrude," Freddy said. When Byrne ignored him, Freddy grabbed him again. "You don't want to see this." Byrne scowled, shook himself loose, and darted for the steps before Freddy could try to drag him from the house. Freddy cursed under his breath and followed. He reached for Byrne's coat a third time, but the other man was younger, quicker, and reached the second floor before Freddy could catch up to him. The top step might as well have been a brick wall. This was as far as Freddy was willing to go. On that last step, he watched as Byrne slunk along the corridor and peered into one room, then moved on to the next. Before he reached that room, the noises began. From the room at the end of the hall came a sound Freddy had heard once before in life, and far too often in nightmares. The sound of shears plunging into flesh, a wet, violent puncture, and then the hushed metal clack of the shears being used. Byrne reached the door from which the noises emanated. Freddy had warned him, had as much as told him without telling him, but the fool had needed to see for himself. Grim fascination, perhaps, or pure sadism. Freddy didn't think it mattered which. In that bedroom doorway, Byrne stood with his eyes widening and let out a scream of horror. Freddy knew he should run, but his feet moved him in the wrong direction, toward his friend, instead of away. He rushed up behind Byrne and clamped a hand over his mouth. It muffled the scream, and a second later Byrne went silent, perhaps realizing how foolish he'd been. "Quickly," Freddy whispered in his ear. "Let's go." Byrne whimpered but did not move. Freddy nearly dragged him, but in glancing up at his friend, he had a view over Byrne's shoulder and into the bedroom. One of the Schnabelperchten straddled the woman on the bed, using its shears to open her from groin to breastbone. The whole room was in disarray, clothes piled everywhere, plates and cups on the nightstands. On the floor, the second inspector knelt beside the corpse of the husband. His guts had been laid open by the shears of the Schnabelperchten, and the creature had reached both hands into the dead man's torso, and now slid intestines out from his steaming insides, hand over hand, arranging them around the body with a kind of artistry. The Schnabelperchten disemboweling the man on the floor kept working, but the one in the bed had frozen in the midst of cutting, disrupted by Byrne's scream. Shears in hand, it turned its eyeless, mouthless beak toward them, and Freddy could feel the weight of its regard, knew that despite the lack of eyes, the creature studied them. The dead woman's head lolled to one side. Perhaps she had not quite been dead. But now her sightless eyes seemed to gaze at the two men in her bedroom doorway as if accusing them, as if asking why they had not stopped this, why they did not step in, even now, to prevent the further evisceration and desecration that would unfold here. Freddy held his breath, telling himself that none of this was his fault. These people had comforts that had been beyond his grasp for years. They had heat and running water and a roof over their heads. They had quiet nights in which they could pretend the rest of the world did not exist. They had food to eat, and they'd had each other. He told himself they must not be from Salzburg, or they were jaded young people who did not believe in the old stories. He told himself perhaps they had been unpleasant people whose neighbors and friends did not care for them enough to warn them, to teach them the importance of a tidy home. "Freddy?" Byrne whispered, his voice cracking. The hooded Schnabelperchten tilted its head, its focus more intent. "Gee, gee, gee," it whispered, with no mouth. Freddy backed away from the bedroom doorway, tugging Byrne with him. The moment they began to retreat, the Schnabelperchten on the bed returned to gutting the woman, no longer interested in the witnesses. Hauling Byrne behind him by the wrist, Freddy bustled down the stairs and out the front door. It clacked shut behind them, the noise like a whip crack in the night. The snow fell thicker and heavier now, and the creatures on the street moved like ghosts, their soft chee, chee, chee carried on the wind. Instinct sent Freddy down a side street. A Schnabelperchten emerged alone from a doorway, gore dripping thick and red from its shears. Its beak did not turn toward them, but it paused and stood in statuesque silence as they passed. "Where are we going?" Byrne whispered, voice cracking. "My spot," Freddy said, as if it were the stupidest question in the world. Byrne twisted his wrist free and stopped, there in the quiet of Epiphany night. "Too exposed. We need to hide." For the first time, Freddy saw the tears in his eyes, the wetness of his cheeks, red from the cold. He wanted to tell Byrne they had nothing to worry about, that they had no homes and therefore were in no danger. But he had not liked the way the creature inside that second house had noticed them, looked at them, if it could be said to look at anything. "Where then?" Byrne wiped at his tears. He hesitated a moment, as if making a decision, then waved for Freddy to follow. With Byrne leading the way, they jogged along the street, then through a side alley, along an old stone wall, then behind an ugly, no-frills hotel. Through a gap in the fence behind the hotel, they emerged in a lot of a used car dealership and an auto body shop. The pavement had cracks everywhere, weeds growing up between them. Freddy looked back through the gap in the fence and felt a ripple of relief. There was no sign of the Schnabelperkten. "I think we're okay," he said. "This way," Byrne replied. He led Freddy to the other end of the car lot. There were junkers back here, probably only used for parts. Byrne brought him to an ugly gray auto union station wagon from the late 1950s, tucked between the shells of cars in even worse condition. Rusted and dented, the windshield covered in snow, the wagon was otherwise intact. The tires sagged like an old man's belly. Byrne opened the driver's door, head low, and gestured for Freddy to get in on the passenger side. Aside from the wagon's rear hatch, those were the only two doors. Freddy glanced around, but he realized this wasn't the sort of place that would have a security guard. There were no brand new vehicles here. Inside the car, he tried to close the door as quietly as possible, gritting his teeth at the rusty squeal of its hinges. Byrne shut his door, and then they were out of the wind and the snow. From inside, Freddy could see the windshield was spiderwebbed with cracks and covered in grime under the coating of falling snow. It was certainly cold in the car, but better than being outdoors tonight. "The owner of the shop knows I sleep here," Byrne said, his voice dull and hollow, as if all the life had been drained out of him. "We can hide until morning. Those things will be gone by morning, right?" Freddy nodded. It surprised him that Byrne had brought him to the shelter. They had known each other for long enough that Freddy thought of Byrne as his friend, but if the owner of the car lot really didn't mind Byrne sleeping in this dead, rusty car, it was a secret he had taken a risk in sharing. If Freddy told others, soon there might be a dozen people trying to sleep in these cars, and surely that would lead to the owner having a change of heart. "Thank you," Freddy said. Byrne understood. "I'm trusting you." "I know." That was it. Freddy thought Byrne would want to talk about what they had seen, but Byrne only shivered and then climbed over the seat into the back of the wagon. There were blankets back there, dirty and musty, but warm. Freddy watched as his friend began to dig himself into a kind of nest of blankets and clothing. There were empty bottles and crushed cardboard boxes, and a squat wooden crate that seemed to be Byrne's pantry, with a box of crackers, a jar of some sort of spread, and other things impossible to make out in the dark. In the front seat with Freddy were a half-dozen dog-eared books and the debris of food cartons. It wasn't much, but it was so much better than Freddy's spot. Safer, drier, warmer. He found his envy simmering and forced it away. If he played his cards right and Byrne really trusted him, maybe he could find a junker back here with intact windows and set up a similar berth without pissing off the car lot's owner. Wordlessly, he promised himself he would do nothing to jeopardize Byrne's good luck. "You have a spare blanket?" he asked. Byrne looked at him. With obvious reluctance, he peeled off one of his own blankets and pushed it over the seat back. Freddy knew words were not sufficient, so he tried to put the depth of his gratitude in his eyes and the nod of his head, and then he swaddled himself as best he could and lay down across the front seat. He was sure adrenaline would keep him awake, that he would see the Schnabelperkten when he closed his eyes and be unable to sleep. But in the midst of such worries, he drifted off. And woke to someone screaming his name. A hand gripped his shoulder and shook him hard. Freddy twisted around in the seat and looked up to see wide eyes and a face etched with terror. Byrne loomed over him from the back of the wagon, pointing, shouting. Freddy finally got it, the words making sense. "Start the car!" Byrne screamed at him. "Start the fucking car!" The words didn't make sense at all. The veil of sleep had finally been stripped away, and Freddy knew where they were, in that stretch of junked cars at the back of the parking lot. How was he supposed to start this car? Get the keys, Freddy, under the floor mat. Burn starts.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?